Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual conference. My name is Emily Slater, and I'm the Deputy Director here at the Bretton Woods Committee. We are bright and early here on the East Coast, about 6 a.m. East Coast time here in the U.S., so we thank you for everyone joining us early from the U.S., and we also have a great global audience today, participation from Bretton Woods Committee members and friends from almost all continents across the globe, so we thank everyone for joining us. Today's program will focus on the outcomes from the Third International Conference on Financing for Development and will feature analysis from Dr. Joachim von Amsberg, Vice President of Development Finance at the World Bank, who is joining us live from Addis Ababa today. Dr. von Amsberg will give his impressions on the outcomes of the Addis Conference and insights into whether there was consensus reached on what is needed to finance the Sustainable Development Goals and post-2015 agenda. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this in the upper right-hand corner of your own screen. The orange arrow icon pictured here allows you to collapse and expand the control panel. By default, you have joined the presentation's audio using your computer's speaker system or voice over IP. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select the telephone option in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Please note that if you join via telephone, you will not have the ability to pose questions during the audience Q&A portion. Currently, all participants are in listen-only mode as indicated by the muted icon in the middle of your control panel. During the Q&A portion of the presentation, we will unmute individual lines so participants can pose questions to the panelists. You will also need to ensure that you unmute your microphone from your end as well. The microphone icon on your control panel will turn green when your microphone is enabled. In order to submit questions to today's presenters, please type your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the virtual conference. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the discussion. You may also use the raise your hand function to gain our attention throughout the presentation. Finally, you may view today's virtual conference in full screen mode by clicking the blue square on the control panel. You can click it again to return to the original viewing preferences. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Robert J. Berg, who will be moderating today's discussion. Bob Berg is a longtime Bretton Woods Committee member and a former senior advisor to several UN agencies, including UNICEF, UNDP, UNESCO, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Bob also founded the Office of Evaluation at USAID and was founding chair of evaluation for the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. For several years, he was president and chair of the International Development Conference, the largest forum on international development in the United States. He serves on a number of boards in the nonprofit and for-profit sectors. We are honored to have him moderating our discussion today. With that, I'll ask Bob to kick off our program and introduce our distinguished speaker. Bob, if you'd please take it away.
Thank you very much, Emily, and hello to everybody. And special thanks to our World Bank colleagues broadcasting from Addis Ababa. I'm going to first introduce our speaker and then just pose a little scene setting. Joachim von Amsberg, after his doctorate, joined the World Bank, had country program experience, policy experience in Latin America and the Middle East, was country director in the Philippines and Indonesia, was vice president for operations policy and country services, and now has the distinguished position and great responsibility of vice president of development finance. The conference that he is going to speak on is meant to be the scene setter for two major conferences that essentially are going to say in September, how is humanity going to progress in the coming 15 years? And in December, can we find a sustainable trajectory for global climate? These are multi-trillion-dollar questions. And so in Addis, we want to know whether, in fact, there was enough confidence building that resources can address appropriately these big issues, so that when we go into these upcoming sessions, they are real and not just paper exercises. Joachim, we're very anxious to hear your views. This is a conference that hasn't been particularly elaborately covered in the press, and so you are our main source right now. Tell us what's been going on.
Yeah, good morning and good afternoon, Bob, and many thanks for the opportunity to report from the Addis Ababa conference. In fact, it is 1 in the afternoon here in Addis on the last day of a 4-day conference, and I'm sitting right in the UN Conference Center here in the heart of Addis Ababa, just about to go into the closing plenary session. So what I'm reporting here is very much live progress. Bob, as you mentioned, this is actually quite a remarkable event in a quite remarkable year, and a year that is really very important for international development and really the future of the planet. You've referred to the planned adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in September, and that will be followed by the COP negotiation in Paris on climate change. And the Addis Ababa conference really is about how to mobilize and commit the finances necessary for achieving the rather ambitious goal that the global community is about to set itself. Ambitious goals such as eradicating absolute poverty in the next 15 years. That is a very lofty ambition, and yet maybe in some ways holding this conference in Addis actually raises our sights to the fact that it is really quite inspiring that for the first time it is possible to think about such lofty goals and such ambitious goals, such as eradicating poverty within a generation. Many speakers here during the week have reminded us that when people spoke about Ethiopia in the 70s and 80s, people spoke about famine, spoke about the desperation of the people of Ethiopia, whereas today when you're visiting Addis and even when you're traveling in Ethiopia, you recognize, yes, there are still very many development challenges, but you see real progress. You see investment, you see people working, you see economic and social progress. So that setting actually provides a good reminder of how much progress there has been, but also how much more needs to be done to really allow the entire population of the planet to live in dignity and be able to escape from poverty. So for that, of course, the setting of the MDGs and the actions, more than just the setting of goals of the global community, are important. And here in Addis, we have been talking about financing for achieving those goals. And I think what we have seen here in Addis over the last week has been a very large UN conference with, I think, all over 5,000 participants. The negotiation of a document, the so-called Addis Ababa Agenda for Action, which we expect will be adopted this afternoon in the closing plenary session of the conference. But in addition to that core event, about 200 side events where leaders of the countries of the world, development professionals, and private sector representatives and civil society representatives have been debating of how we can really turn the financing of the Sustainable Development Goals into reality. So this conference has been actually quite different from its predecessor conferences. In the large attention paid to and the strong participation in particular of private sector participants. I think about 800 private sector participants have joined the discussions here in Addis, and it has definitely changed the nature of the debate, and I will say something more about that in a moment. I I think the conversations that I've taken here in Addis are a reflection of how much the world and how much the discussion about economic and social development have changed. We have come from a world in the past where you could neatly divide the world into donors and recipients, where development was sort of a linear process from being a poor country to becoming a middle-income country and a rich country. And that world where you could neatly categorize countries and where negotiations would be between developed versus developing countries has changed so fundamentally. I mean, today, every country plays multiple roles. Middle-income countries have become major providers of development finance. Even low-income countries are the source of important development experience, important development knowledge. The crises emanating in high-income countries have become an important impact, sometimes negative impact, on development in poor countries. While insecurity and fragility in poor countries has become a major drag on development in rich countries. So in this sort of multi-directional, multilateral world, we really have to think very differently about development. And the debates this week really reflect this much more multi-directional, multilateral discussion of development and a much more broad approach toward tackling a challenge such as financing for development and financing the Sustainable Development Goals. I think from the outset of the conference, there was a very significant tension between the ambitions of the goals that literally require investments of trillions of dollars every year if one was to achieve those goals, as we all are striving to work toward. So trillions of dollars are necessary to be invested to achieve those goals on the one hand. On the other hand, traditional official development finance or official development assistance runs in the order of $130, $140 billion a year. So any notion that one could, even with increased ODA, finance the SDGs based on ODA or ODA alone, I think was a misconception and probably should be a misconception. And instead, I think the discussion has focused on what will be the main drivers of financing for development and achieving the SDGs. And those two major sources are, on the one hand, the domestic resources, meaning the taxes levied by each and every country and then spent in investment for achievement of the SDGs on the one hand, and secondly, private investment, domestic and international private investment that would be needed to achieve those important developmental outcomes. Now, the catch is neither domestic resources nor private investment automatically flow into investments that will achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's where the link and the important link with international efforts in ODA, official development finance, comes in. Public resources, domestic resources, raising of domestic taxes requires, of course, on the one hand, tax administration, better systems, better taxation institutions, but it also requires the ability to spend resources well, better budgeting, planning, project development, and effective spending that really reaches the poor and the ultimate beneficiaries and targets of public programs. And that requires technical assistance, requires financial support to build up those systems. So that in the long run, countries can sustainably raise taxes and spend them efficiently, build the social contract that citizens, businesses see the services that the government provides are worth the taxes that are being paid. But that needs to be kickstarted with an effort to build those systems, help strengthen expenditures, and that's where official development financing can play such an important role. Same on the side of private financing. Private investments do not follow the appeals of UN conferences. They do not follow in themselves the Sustainable Development Goals. Private investment follows considerations of returns and risks, and therefore creating a national enabling environment, policy environment, the incentives, preparing good projects that allow private investments to flow into investments that, yes, achieve the SDGs, but also pay adequate returns for the risks incurred is so critical for mobilizing private investment. And again, the role of official development finance is to facilitate, unlock that private investment, help governments create the right policy environment, help prepare projects that are viable and that are sustainable in terms of both the return for the investor, but critically also the impact and the services provided to the beneficiaries of those investments. So we've been going into this conference coordinating with the other multilateral development banks and the IMF to kind of propose this narrative that we call from billions to trillions, from the billions, using the billions of official development finance to unlock the trillions of domestic resources and private investment that can then achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's kind of a story and a narrative that says if official development finance is modernized, moves from simply filling financing and investment gaps toward leveraging and catalyzing domestic investments, domestic resources, and private investment, then this modern official development finance actually is even more important than aid official development assistance of the past and can really be the catalyst that helps achieve those ambitious sustainable development goals. Now, together with the multilateral development banks and the IMF, we have come with specific proposals how we can achieve that, proposed this narrative, and we've been, I think, very happy that this narrative has gotten a lot of traction over the last days. We've heard the story of billions to trillions or billions for trillions in many of the conference events, and I think it has resonated and has brought together those who were arguing for increased ODA, and we believe increased ODA is indeed necessary, with those who emphasize the need for private investment and domestic resource mobilization, because we've been able to show how ODA, well and efficiently used, can be targeted exactly at unlocking domestic resources and private investment. So we are quite pleased with the messages coming out of Addis. Today, the outcome document, the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action, will, we expect, be endorsed. It's an ambitious document that embodies many of these aspects of modernizing official development finance and thinking about financing of the SDGs in this broader but ultimately more successful way of how can core official development finance be utilized, but how can it be utilized to unlock domestic financing and private investment. It talks about all the actors and how the actions of the private sector, of the governments in developing countries, of the governments in advanced economies can all do their share to undertake actions that overall and together will be able to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals or provide the financing to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So there has been a much more, I think, modern, much more effective debate than that of previous conferences, and I think less political and less ideological, more practical about approaches and programs and projects and policies that work, and how to amplify those, scale up those, and get away with approaches that have failed in the past. So I'm coming away from Addis, I think, with a quite hopeful message of modernization, of development finance, and of a very broad partnership of civil society, private sector, multilateral institutions, and governments of all countries in the world to commit to an agenda that gives us the hope that the Sustainable Development Goals can in fact be achieved, and that we can, in 2030, which is the time frame for the Sustainable Development Goals, look back to 2015 and say this was really the time when the global community got together and made some pretty significant changes in thinking about development finance, and those changes have allowed the world to eradicate poverty and to really achieve sustainability in the global development. So with that, I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of the discussions here in Addis, but I'm happy to elaborate more on any aspects that may be of interest to you. But again, many thanks for your interest, and back to you, Bob.
Thank you very, very much. That's a very positive statement, and one you often don't necessarily hear after these global meetings. And I think that, personally, I think that the joint Development Bank positions helped, and the IMF positions helped in this momentum. So let's talk about, I mean, we understand there's almost a kind of a quid pro quo being talked about now of taxation and investment policy, reforms and improvements to unlock the billions to get the trillions. The what roles now did you see the bilaterals and also the new development banks? What did you hear from them?
Yeah, I think you're rightly referring to the roles of different players in implementing the Addis agenda. And yes, I did want to convey a positive message from Addis, but of course, whether we will look back to Addis with this positive spirit will depend on the implementation, and that will depend on the different actors that have come together here. While I think each player and each actor goes home with their own agenda, I think the Addis conversations have shown how the actions of these different actors fit together. And you refer to a quid pro quo. I would talk about complementarity between the roles of different actors. National governments will have to play the central role. They are leading the development efforts of their own countries. They are sovereigns. They are the decision makers on policy, from taxation to regulation in their respective countries. So they will have to play an absolutely crucial role in setting the policy environment for the implementation in their respective countries. But that applies to governments in all countries. There is an obligation for governments in high-income countries to, for example, engage and help on illicit financial flows, on taxation, to ensure that, and there was plenty of debate about that, to ensure that the interests of developing countries and ensuring that they are able to capture adequate taxation from international investments, for example, that those efforts are supported. The bilateral agencies, but it also holds for multilateral agencies like ourselves, I think are committing themselves to put increased emphasis on exactly supporting those efforts by government that are aimed at unlocking the trillions. So we saw commitments by many agencies to increase their support for domestic resource mobilization, tax administration, expenditure management in developing countries. And I think that's a very welcome focus on a particularly catalytic area of investment. Similarly, you saw quite a few development agencies increase their commitments to help with the unlocking of private investment for infrastructure in particular. When we talk about trillions, a large share of those investment needs are lying in infrastructure, sustainable energy, water supply, transport, telecommunications, and the like. In infrastructure, you see on the one hand large supply of, or the possibility of private investors coming in, and you see many investment needs. But often the two don't come together, and their development agencies can provide the support necessary to build the project pipeline, develop financially and technically viable projects, structure financing packages for those projects that ensure, one, the service delivery, and two, the adequate return for investors. And we saw quite a few development partners, including the development banks, commit to increased action in this area. You have mentioned that there are new actors in the development scene, new development banks that have been founded recently. They have not yet been very active discussion participants here, and yet they have been talked about, and I think their shareholders have expressed their expectation that these new development banks will participate in this global effort to mobilize and unlock resources that are necessary to transform economies and transform lives from poverty to productive and dignified lives in the future. So we really saw, I think, a coming together around this Addis agenda, which gives, I think, space and a role for all players who are willing and need to contribute to the development outcomes.
So I just have two other quick questions, and then we're going to open it up. Both have to do with new innovations. One is the private sector investment. On the one hand, there wasn't much progress in terms of taxation reform for multinational corporations, and some clear resistance to those reforms coming out of this conference, which is a kind of a slightly jarring note if one wants to encourage taxation reform in developing countries. But was there more to the private sector side that you heard that indicated to you new areas of innovation in private sector? And just to add the last question, tell us if there are new ideas at the bank for innovations in leveraging finance in your own portfolio.
Yeah, thank you for those, I think, very important questions. First, on taxation. Since there was so much talk about domestic resources, there was a lot of debate about taxation. But of course, an international conference such as this one is not the forum where actually new tax rules will be developed. What has happened here is a commitment to provide increased attention and support to developing countries in developing their tax systems, make their tax systems more efficient, more effective, and more fair. But also a commitment from advanced economies and from the private sector to support that. And that is really an important, I think, step forward. A message that adequate taxation cannot be just left to developing countries' governments alone, but there needs to be a compact that is supported by other actors. And I've heard many private sector leaders speak here and express the view that if tax systems are efficient and equitably implemented, they are very much willing and committed to paying their fair share to contribute to the taxation efforts in developing countries. And that's very important, and the commitment that I think developing country leaders and governments will follow up on in the implementation over the next years. Frankly, we as Development Bank are keen to ensure that the voice of developing countries and the interest of developing countries is heard in the international fora that will discuss changes in the international aspects of taxation. So I think I want to put an emphasis there. We want to make sure that the voices of developing countries are heard in whatever fora will take these issues forward. And I think it's right that this Addis conference drew so much attention to these issues of helping developing countries broaden their tax base, develop their tax systems, and equitably implementing those tax systems. And I think developing country governments can count on the support of many actors going forward after this conference. Secondly, you asked about, I think, specific ideas for increasing private investment. And here I just want to speak about some of the ideas that we've put on the table or actually very concretely working on to increase private investment in developing countries. One first initiative that is already underway, but which we're scaling up, is that our private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation, has created an asset management company and has created a co-financing facility where other investors, private investors, can invest alongside our IFC in private investments in developing countries. This is, in a sense, a way of leveraging and mobilizing additional private capital that can free ride or ride on the very strong track record of IFC to invest in private sector in developing countries in a way that generates adequate rates of return. So this is a way of scaling up what we are already doing with our public support to generally attract additional private investment at a substantial scale. Several billion of dollars are already invested in this asset management company and in the co-financing facilities, and that's something we plan to scale up substantially. And we do see the interest from private investors in that. Secondly, I want to come back again to infrastructure and private investment in infrastructure. We recently created the so-called Global Infrastructure Facility. That facility is particularly designed to make investment in developing country infrastructure viable for institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, which are seeking to diversify their investments, are in principle very interested in investing in developing country infrastructure, but often don't have the infrastructure or the expertise to go on a project-by-project basis. So here the Global Infrastructure Facility is working on the project pipeline, structuring projects, helping to develop an asset class of infrastructure in developing countries by bucketing the risks appropriately, working with developing countries to reduce risks, in particular where the sovereign or where the governments have the ability to reduce risks that sometimes emanate from public action, and thereby make these investments more viable. So there we are working on a pipeline of projects, and we have a lot of, I think, positive signals from both the investors as well as the project sponsors that this is a business that we can expand considerably in the next year, and therefore really fill that critical missing middle between the investors and the demand for project financing.
Excellent. Emily, would you like to take it from here to open it up to our audience?
Yes, thanks, Bob, and thank you, Joachim, for your wonderful remarks and insights into the dialogue that's taking place there in Addis. It sounds like there's really a lot of positive energy and momentum that's coming out of the discussions there, and so we're delighted to hear that. I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, to please let me know by typing them into the questions box in your control panel or by using the raise your hand function. I'd like to start with a question of my own, and we've been talking a lot about the private sector as we should be, and we know that private sector investment is critical to the financing element and the implementation of the SDGs. And I'm just wondering if you're getting a sense that the private sector is stepping up to the plate as well and is willing to do what they're being called upon to do. Some have argued that maybe perhaps we're putting too much of the onus on the private sector. So I'm just wondering what their response has been.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the answer lies in a mindset shift about how private sector engages in a development agenda. I spoke about the change from the old world to the new world. I think in the old world, one might have thought about sort of creating a big table and listing the investment needs and then plotting in who is paying how much. If one tried to plot in the private sector of where it would finance the investment needs for sustainable development, I think you wouldn't get very far, because the private sector does not invest based on sort of a global planning matrix on where the investment needs. Private investors are looking for returns, and they're looking at returns that are adequate for the risks they are taking. And so with an old approach of saying, well, here private sector come in and finance this and that sector or this and that country, I think you don't get very far. But I'm so pleased to see that the debate here has been entirely different. It has been about how to create the enabling environment that allows the private sector to unfold its potential, to unlock its interest in investing in growing economies. It has shown that if one talks about the projects and the way of structuring a project so that there are no undue risks in the project that private sector investors would not be willing to take on, then I think one gets into a very different debate, and that's what we've seen here. So I've heard many private sector leaders speak at the conference here, and I think very generally talk about their profound interests of their companies or their investors in playing an important role in the growing economies of the developing world. I think private sector investment, private companies, and of course we're talking about a myriad of very different actors, from multinational companies to institutional investors to the indigenous private sector in developing countries, know that there is a tremendous growth opportunity for them to play a role in the development and growth of the developing world. And frankly, that the solution to many of the challenges that we're talking about here, take for example the challenge of sustainability and finding energy supply for hundreds of millions of people who don't have energy, but doing that in a way that is compatible with the climate change challenges the world is facing. That requires technological solutions. That creates new markets that companies who offer technologically advanced solutions are extremely interested in. So if one thinks about it in those terms, what are the markets, what is the policy environment that would allow companies and private sector to invest, and how can one shape the market and the regulation of those markets in a way that ensures that the benefits of that investments accrue to the population of developing countries and ultimately lead to attainment of sustainable development goals. I think with that mindset, I've seen a lot of very constructive discussions. That is no longer the ideological discussion we would have seen a decade or two ago, where people would have argued about whether private sector is good or bad. I think now we are seeing a much more pragmatic discussion about how to harness the potential power of the private sector in a way that ensures the attainment of social and developmental goals. And I have seen CEOs and investors very actively engaged in exactly that debate here.
Thank you for that great response. I do think that the private sector is going to be critical to the successful implementation of the post-2015 agenda. So it's good to hear this shift in attitude and a more practical approach. We do have a few questions from the audience, so I would like to go ahead and take those questions. We'd like to start with Mahesh Kotecha. I have unmuted your line, so please make sure that your microphone is enabled, and you may go ahead and pose your question. I think we're having some problems with the audio, so I have the question here that Mahesh would like to pose. His question is, how effective do you think the MDG-related financing for development efforts were, and what specific lessons were drawn from that in the Agenda for Action in Addis?
I think that's a very good question, because of course the MDGs and the experience of the MDGs over the last 15 years has been on everybody's minds. The MDG I think the evaluation of the MDGs is differentiated or mixed. What I mean to say is, on the one hand, the MDGs, I think, have been very effective to focus the minds of key actors. It was the first time that the objectives, the goals of development have been articulated. I think they have contributed tremendously to a public mobilization effort to focus on what matters for people, what matters for development that really benefits people. And in that sense, I think they have supported the mobilization of, in particular, public finance and official development assistance. But the MDGs have not been universally successful. Not all the MDGs have been achieved, even though there has been lots of progress on other fronts. So I think the main changes or evolutions and lessons from the MDGs and from financing for now the SDGs has been the recognition for a need of a broader set of players to partner together. And this links back to the comments I made earlier, that the achievement of the SDGs cannot be left to one sector or one set of actors alone. It is not only the matter of governments in one set of countries, in developing countries or developed countries, nor is it only the private sector, nor is it only development agencies or only civil society. It is really each of those actors that have to play their own role that is distinct from each other, but that together can achieve the objectives that we're talking about here. So I think there has been a great, evolution from the MDGs. Of course, the SDGs are also more ambitious in the sense that they are universal, apply to all countries, and I'm sure we'll see plenty of discussion of that universality leading to the UN summit in September. But I think rightly, most of the focus here of the financing for development discussion has been on developing countries and how to ensure that developing countries, who of course face the biggest challenge financing the achievement of the SDGs, can create the environment that is necessary for the SDGs to be achieved and to be financed. So I think interesting learning of lessons, and I think sort of mixed record of the MDGs. Interesting to see how some speakers emphasize a lot how much the MDGs have actually achieved and how much progress there has been, and they're right. But other speakers have likewise emphasized the MDGs and some of the health areas that have not been achieved and how much more work remains to be done. And I think rightly increased emphasis has been given now to some areas. In particular, health, for example, has received a lot of attention during this conference.
Thank you. I would now I think we have time probably for one more question, so I'd like to invite Andrew Comstock to pose his question. Andrew, you are unmuted, so if you would please pose your question.
Hello, good morning. My name is Andrew Comstock. I'm from Georgetown University, and my question has to do with Addis Ababa and climate change. Increasing access to energy, especially renewable energy, has been highlighted in the draft of the Addis outcome document and is a high priority for the World Bank. Do you think that the Addis conference has begun to generate the momentum needed to translate into successful climate change negotiations in Paris later this year? Thank you very much.
Thank you for, I think, connecting the development finance with the climate finance discussion. And I do think we have made quite a bit of progress thinking holistically about the financing need for sustainable development. And the sustainable development goals in themselves, by incorporating the dimension of sustainability, I think almost force us to think in an integrated way about sustainability and development and financing both development but financing also the climate agenda. Of course, the focus here was on the developmental side, the focus of the Addis conference, whereas over the course of the year, the focus will shift toward climate financing. But the need for climate finance was very much on the minds of conference participants here. I think one important strand of the discussion that I heard again and again was, I think, the acknowledgement of how important the so-called co-benefits are, of how strong the connections are between sustainable development, the needs for, and I think you mentioned the energy sector as a prime example, where we have to find ways of serving unmet energy needs, but have to serve those needs in a way that's compatible with the climate change threats. And a recognition that when you invest in sustainable energy, that is both a contribution toward a climate change, contribution toward fighting climate change, as well as a contribution toward development. When you invest in sustainable agriculture systems, climate resilient agriculture systems, that's an investment in the well-being and the livelihood of farmers for the development, but it's also an investment for climate. So there is this large area of co-benefits or of investments that have benefit both for development and for protecting the climate of the planet. And I think there will be a greatly increasing interest in that area of co-benefits. I think that paves the way toward also a successful outcome of the Copenhagen conference. Again, I think I heard more pragmatic discussions here and less ideological discussion about this challenging, I think, tension between development finance and climate finance, and this very strong focus on these win-win solution or co-benefit solutions, of which I mentioned a few examples. But I think just like in the other areas that were discussed here, we have, I think, set up a framework here that works for development and works for climate finance, but follow up by all actors is absolutely essential. I think we have a good document, we have goodwill from all participants, but I think also the first actions taken over the next months to show that players and the actors are serious about implementing the commitments made here, it will be very important as a contribution toward a successful outcome of the climate negotiations at the end of the year.
Thanks again, Dr. Williamsburg, and thank you to our audience for your wonderful questions. I'd now like to turn it back over to Bob to either ask a final question or offer some final remarks before we wrap up for the day. Bob, back to you.
I realize, Joachim, you and your colleagues have still work to do, and the vote is still coming up, so we'll let you go soon. I just wanted to say that if the World Bank were listed on a private stock exchange, I think I'd like to pick up a few more shares after hearing this discussion. Very, very constructive and helpful. I wanted to just say that there will be a number of challenges ahead with this extremely ambitious sustainable development goal and climate discussions. And I, as a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, I think I can say that we stand ready to be helpful on those discussions and to be called upon by the bank and members to see how we can best play a role to assure, particularly with the sustainable development goals, that countries don't treat them as if they were on a strict diet going through a buffet line, taking a spoon of this and a spoon of that, as opposed to seeing the importance of the whole. So thank you very much for your time, and congratulations to the bank and to its other multilateral development bank institutions for helping to frame this important discussion.
Thank you very much, Bob. We'll be heading now into the closing plenary session, where hopefully we will adopt this document that negotiators have brought to conclusion last night. Yes, the World Bank is not for sale, so we cannot offer our shares, but it is actually quite important for us to show to our shareholders, and of course your government is our largest shareholder, that we're making every effort possible to turn their investments into these shares, into the biggest development results and development outcomes. And much of what we discussed here in the session is really about how we modernize our investments to make sure that really these investments produce the maximum results for fighting poverty, sharing prosperity, and the other goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. So many thanks for the opportunity to, I think, talk about the Addis conference and the World Bank's work here. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, and on behalf of the entire Bretton Woods Committee, I'd just like to thank you again for joining us live from Addis. We know you've had a busy week, and we appreciate you making time in your schedule, and we appreciate Bob joining us bright and early this morning here. And I thought that the dialogue was incredibly rich and insightful, and just would like to thank you both again. And just a final closing remark, if anyone would like to contact the committee regarding today's virtual conference, please take note of the contact information on the slide. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email within the next 24 to 48 hours that contains our contact information as well if you need to get in touch with us. And will also contain a link to listen to a recording of today's virtual conference. We will also post that link to our website in the coming days. So once again, on behalf of the entire Bretton Woods Committee, we thank you all for joining us today. Everyone have a wonderful day.